In this video, we'll be taking a look at stakeholder identification, and the specific learning objectives will be to first take a look at what the definition for stakeholders are for a process improvement project. It's a little bit different than in traditional projects. Then we'll take a look at when we do stakeholder identification and why it's an important precursor to the voice of customer interviews that take place in DMAIC style projects. Then we'll review 3 approaches at developing a large list of possible stakeholders, including stakeholder nomination, using generic stakeholder models, and document analysis. Before we dive into the approaches that we use to create a broad list of stakeholders and stakeholder identification, I thought I'd take a quick timeout and at a high level, try to answer the what, whys, and whens of stakeholder analysis. When it comes to a process improvement project, our definition of stakeholders are a little bit different than the traditional definition used for project stakeholders. Generically speaking, the definition of a stakeholder is any person with an interest or a concern in a particular set of actions. For most traditional solution-based projects, a stakeholder is further refined, and it's a person or a group of people that in some way are affected by the project work to be done. For a process improvement project, though, I refine that just a little bit further. For process improvement projects, my definition of stakeholders are: when we're dealing with process improvement stakeholders, we're looking at any of the specific people affected. This could be individual team members, individual process workers, individual customers, individual suppliers, the departmental groups of individuals that help to fulfill service requests. But here's an important one that I think makes it a little bit different in the definition. We're also taking a look at the systems that are affected by this process and by the set of activities that we're doing to try to improve this process. People, groups of people, or systems affected by the process improvement work that's done. Here's why we do stakeholder identification. All right, I've cleaned up my screen a little bit, and what I'm doing now is I've pulled the DMAIC-based process improvement methodology summary sheet and zoomed in on the define phase. And when we're taking a look at a large-scale process improvement project, a process that spans multiple work groups, maybe the entire enterprise, and we're trying to do data-driven problem solving using this 5-step methodology called DMAIC. In the define phase, there is a really important tool we call voice of customer interviews. A whole video describing techniques for doing it, but it's one of the primary ways that we capture qualitative feedback on current state performance. It's a very powerful tool, but here's the dilemma with it. It only works well if you're interviewing the most important stakeholders that are affected by this process. If you just interview anybody, you might not get a real understanding of what's going on in current state, and you for sure are going to waste a lot of team time. So we do stakeholder identification as a precursor to voice of customer interviews to make sure that the individuals and groups of people and the systems that are affected are exposed first to prepare us for who we should be spending our time on interviews. Stakeholder identification in a process improvement project is primarily used to help us prepare for the interviews. It's because of that this isn't that I don't want to say it's not important, but it isn't as critical a step or activity if the type of process improvement project has very few number of stakeholders that are affected. So for example, in a Kaizen event where the process is typically one that's been scoped down to be in one work group area, well, the stakeholders affected primarily are going to be the process workers who make up the team. So there isn't as much of a need to do stakeholder analysis. You've got the stakeholders in the room. You can ask them right there before you do your lean waste identification. But for larger scale domain projects, where not all of the stakeholders are going to be represented by team members, it's an important precursor step to the voice of customer interviews. So there's the why and the when for stakeholder identification. So now that we have the the what, the why, and the when identified for stakeholder identification, let's take a look at the how to create a big, broad list of possible stakeholders that will go out and interview for voice of customer interviews. All right, I've cleaned up my screen just a little bit and I'm pulling pictures and information from our business process improvement workbook. And what I'd like to do now is just take a look at how do we create this large list of possible stakeholders that will go out and interview. The approach is first create a large list, and then later we'll use prioritization techniques in a separate video and narrow that list to the final most important stakeholders to go out and interview. And the techniques that we'll use to create this large list that we prioritize later, well, there are three approaches. The most popular approach is something that we call stakeholder nomination. It's just a modified form of brainstorming where you bring the team into the room, maybe with a facilitator and a whiteboard, and you ask the team who are all of the people, groups of people, and systems that are affected by this process. Frequently, I'll have our high-level process map and our project charter right next to us for reference, and then it just becomes a short brainstorming session where those names of individuals, groups, and systems are thrown on a board, either using post-it notes or just writing it down on a flip chart of some sort. I'm not surprised to see in a 5 or 10 minute brainstorming session 15 to 20 different stakeholder groups that the team identifies. The problem, though, with brainstorming only or this nomination approach is that sometimes you don't hear from all of your team members. Brainstorming often is an approach that's best suited for your more extroverted team members. But your more introverted team members have ideas, but the way that brainstorming is set up, where we as quickly as possible throw out any idea, um, any thought is a possibility. It doesn't matter about the quality of the thought. It's about quantity, not quality. That sometimes is very constraining for more introverted team members. So what I sometimes like to do is a second technique. It's called referring to generic models. Uh, I'll still frame it to my team as a brainstorming session, but I will make the request in advance. I'll ask the team, hey, let's meet in our team war room on a particular time. But in advance of the meeting, I'd like you to take a look at a generic stakeholder model. It's not the names of the specific individuals or the specific groups or the specific systems of our process improvement project. It's a generic one. And I'd like you to look at that generic list and then convert those generic names into the specific people, groups of people, and systems that we'll be working on. Put each one of those stakeholder references on a post-it note and then bring it to the meeting. It's a prepare in advance approach. What's nice about this is it helps the team identify stakeholders that might have been in their blinders where they just hadn't even considered them. It allows your more introverted team members to prepare for their thoughts in advance, and it supports the brainstorming activity that is quick and easy. It's kind of the best of both worlds. So let's take a look at three real common stakeholder models that might be used. All right, I know I said we take a look at three, but I'm going to bring up four just so you've got some different approaches that you can consider. Again, these are generic models that I would send out to my team in advance of a brainstorming session on identifying stakeholders. In your business process improvement workbook, I have one, two, three, four different models for you to choose from. And like I said, I will copy and paste this into a meeting invite, or I'll post it on a wall before we actually do the brainstorming. And it's just a way for people to prepare in advance possible stakeholders. This is more of a list of already established generic stakeholders. The onion model is frequently used when we're taking a look at more of an IT system approach. Um, this voice of this particular stakeholder model is called a voice of customer model, and it's a little bit more product driven. But my favorite right here is the octagon model. It's very simple and it's easy to use in a facilitated session. Let me zoom in on the octagon model. When I send out one of these generic stakeholder models, my directions are usually to I take a look at the generic list and then identify or assign specific names of people, groups of people, or systems that are associated with each of the generic names. And sometimes it's a one-to-one match where for a particular stakeholder like regulators, so like for that stakeholder, it's a one-to-one match. Sometimes it's a one-to-many match where for one generic name, you're going to have many different groups. And in some cases, you might have for a generic name no values where it just doesn't make sense for the given process improvement project that we're working on. I just let team members know about it in advance. They bring each of these as separate post-it notes. And then at the beginning of our brainstorming session, we post those post-it notes first. That creates the beginning of our list, and we then add to that post-it note list with our brainstorm ideas. It's kind of a modified brainstorming and generic model combination approach. Most often the technique that I use. There is a third technique, though, that I want to make sure that we make mention of. Let's look at that one next. A third technique that we'll use is to do document analysis. And in a document analysis approach, I'll assign to a team member or to a couple of team members in advance of our brainstorming meeting. I'll have them take a look at already existing documents to see if stakeholder lists have already been created. You know, why reinvent the wheel? Let's borrow from an already created list. And some of those documents that contain stakeholder lists that might be useful include in many organizations, lots of past process improvement projects have occurred, and you have an archive of those past projects. You can take a look at the project charters and see if that list of stakeholders could be used for your own process improvement project. Oftentimes, for larger enterprise implementation, a business requirements document may contain stakeholder lists. Also, looking in your procurement area and the RFPs and RFIs, they often require a stakeholder list to be included. But here's one that I sometimes suggest, and that is instead of looking internally at documents, look externally through professional associations and case write-ups of projects that were similar to the ones that you've created. Use the list that others developed in those case write-ups. They may give you some insight. With that said, I'll be honest, stakeholder document analysis is typically time consuming and has limited return. I find that the first two approaches, brainstorming and generic stakeholder models, in 15 minutes of brainstorming and generic stakeholder models can create a list that's just as thorough as a document analysis approach that may have taken one of your team members hours or even days. So use it sparingly if you decide to do document analysis. Three different approaches. All of them will give you a large list then of possible stakeholders that you may want to go out and interview. What we'll have to do next is take that large list and shrink it down to the few.